Between the dunes and the dawn asterisk, the stranger who would not cross the line, the desert of Aurelian sang when the heat rose, a thin, glassy whine that braided through the gullies and made the dune grass shiver like a field of tiny bells. Cerise kept her daughter close whenever the sands raised their voice. Songs drew things. Songs remembered. On Aurelian memory could be a predator. They found the wreck at first light metal bitten open, hull ribs splayed like a burst seed. Cerise tasted the air for ozone and burned plastics, then swept her palm over Miri's hair. Back, she whispered in their tongue. We look, we learn, we leave. But Miri had already seen the handprint near the torn hatch. 5 blunt finger marks smeared with soot. The stories said raiders left handprints like that. The stories also said humans did. Miri pressed herself into Cerise's side. Is it one of them? Ceres listened. The sand was settling, its pitch dropping from alarm to ordinary complaint. Somewhere within the ruin, something clicked, the cooling of a panel, or the careful movement of a thing that did not want to be heard. It is someone, Cerise said, and we are too. They circled, keeping the long curve of a boulder between themselves and the open hatch. On the far side, half in shadow, a figure knelt by a broken case, back turned. Broad shoulders under a dust cloak, bare head cropped close, skin the color of old bronze. He worked with slow hands, making small piles, salvage here, scrap there. He did not carry a weapon that she could see. Cerise tapped the glass disc at her throat. The translator found years ago in a trader's box and coaxed back to life-form, hummed, and began to listen. When the man finally sensed them, he didn't spin for a weapon or leap for cover. He lifted both hands, palms open, and turned with a deliberate slowness that respected the distance between beings who didn't yet share a language. Hello, he said, in common, voice steady but frayed. I'm not looking for trouble. The disc at Cerise's throat tried to make sense of the sounds and offered a mush of broken syllables. She didn't answer. Mary's fingers dug crescents into her cloak. The man glanced at the girl and immediately lowered his gaze so he was not staring. Sorry, he said, softer. You're right to be careful. He reached into the pocket of his cloak, and Cerise stiffened, thrusting her arm out to put herself between him and Miri. He froze. Palm turned out so she could see it was empty, then drew slowly a squat metal flask with a blue cap. He set it on the sand, slid it forward with 2 fingers, and backed his hand away. Water, condensation beaded the metal. Miri's breath hitched. Ceres kept her voice flat. Why? The man didn't understand, but tone translates when words fail. He pushed the water another length and, with his other hand, drew a rough circle on the ground, then 2 dots within it. He tapped the dots, then the flask, then held his palms up again. For you too, Cerise didn't move. In the stories, gifts came with hooks. The man seemed to read something in her face. He nodded once, as if conceding a point, and without turning his back edged away from the flask, step by slow step, until he stood a long pace beyond reach. He pointed at the ground between them, traced a line with his boot. He stood on his side of it and did not cross. Miri tugged. Cerise looked down at her daughter. Miri was thin from a summer of poor dew. The desert's hunger had long fingers. Cerise lifted the flask herself, tasted, waited for fire behind the tongue. Cool, clean, plain. She gave Miri a swallow before taking any more. The man's shoulders softened at the sight. He kept his hands visible, the line unbroken between his boots and theirs. When Cerise capped the flask and set it on the sand, he lifted both palms again, a shape that meant, "I will not take back what I gave." The translator disc finally found a thread of his vowels. Name, Jonah, it hummed, late and halting. Ship, down. Cerise touched her chest. Cerise, she tilted her head toward Miri. Miri. He nodded, as if he would pocket the names somewhere he wouldn't lose them. "I'll move on at dusk," he said, speaking to the translator as if it were a skittish animal. "I'll keep away from your home." Miri watched him from behind Cerise's cloak. Why did he give water? She breathed, in a whisper too small for the world. Cerise did not answer then. In truth, she did not know. They saw Jonah again 2 days later at the edge of the old salt flats. Cerise had led Miri there at dawn to check the siphons she'd hidden. Thin reeds sunk into patches where the night air lingered. One siphon had failed. Its tube clogged with grit and its reservoir cracked from thaw and heat. Miri knelt, and quiet frustration bled across her face the way heat shimmered across the flats. Cerise set a hand on her shoulder. "Some lessons the desert taught with teeth. We try again," she said. Metal tapped stone behind them. Cerise spun, cloak flaring, body between the sound and the girl. Jonah stood on the far side of a low ridge, hands raised, a respectful distance away. He gestured to the broken siphon, then to the coil of tubing in his arms. With 2 fingers he asked, "May I?" Cerise's mouth tightened. No, he accepted the refusal without a visible bruise. Slowly, keeping to the line of respectful space, he crouched beside a different patch of damp and began to set his own device a squat. Ugly thing of scavenged fins and battered mesh. He planted 3 thin rods like the bones of a small animal and unfolded a screen with the grace of someone who made his living coaxing. Cooperation from reluctant parts. Miri crept to the edge of Cerise's shadow and watched. Jonah spoke as he worked, not at them but near them, narrating in plain syllables for the translator's sake, maybe for their comfort, maybe for his own. "Hot side here," he said. "Cold there. Pressure likes to argue, so I give it to places to sit." He grinned ruefully at his own words, as if the joke had never once landed, but he refused to stop telling it. Asterisk when he finished. He set a battered tin cup beneath the mesh and watched. A minute later, a clear thread beated, fattened, fell. The sound was tiny. It carried like thunder. He shifted away so Miri could see the cup without stepping close. He didn't push it toward her. He didn't name it a gift. He just let it be water where there hadn't been any. Miri's fingers tightened in Cerise's cloak. Her eyes kept flicking from the drip to the man's face, as if waiting for him to lunge. Jonah pointed past the ridge. "Stormline," the translator offered a beat later. On the horizon, a pale wall gathered itself into a thought. "You should be under cover by second bell." Cerise read the sky and found his reading sound. She nodded once acknowledgement of the weather, not of the man, and took Miri's hand. They moved. They were halfway to the basalt gullies when Miri stumbled. A sound like a choked cry slipped out of her, and Cerise turned so fast the world blurred. Miri had dropped the little chime she wore, a disc of carved shell that had belonged to Cerise's mother. It lay in the dust near Jonah's line of patient cups. Cerise had left too many things in sand. To leave this, she took a step toward it and stopped. On the other side of the unseen line, Jonah had bent, scooped the chime, and stood hands held away from his body, the chimes swinging carefully from 2 fingers. He did not cross. He did not call out. He set the chime down exactly on the line and backed 3 steps, palms open. Cerise held herself still, every sinew hot. The wind pushed her cloak against her knees. The chime glowed faintly in the raw light. Miri slipped free of her mother and darted forward, quick as a lizard's thought. She snatched the chime and scurried back. Cerise exhaled through her teeth and the burn in her throat cooled. Jonah watched the exchange without reaching. He nodded once, not to them, not to himself, but to the line for doing its work. The storm pinned them in the gullies by noon. Wind turned the sky to milk and the dunes to muscle. Cerise blocked the entrance to the crack where she'd tucked Miri, cloak braced against the mouth. Each gust thudded against her spine. She counted the beats between lightning and thunder and kept her. Body between the desert and the child. A shape appeared in the whiteout. A man leaning into the gale, dragging something by its straps. Cerise's jaw locked. Her hand found the glass knife at her belt as if it had grown there. Jonah halted a clear 3 strides away and bent over the thing he'd hold. He unrolled it with slow, obvious hands. A panel of dark fabric with flexible ribs, the skin of some collapsed shelter. He pressed 2 stakes into the grit, fed the ribs, and without speaking turned so the wind caught the panel and held it in a taut, humming curve over the crack. The gusts softened at Cerise's back. The shriek of blown grit dropped to a hiss. The gully's mouth became a throat that swallowed the storm instead of coughing it back. Jonah didn't linger. He nodded once habit. Ritualan stepped away from the mouth, further into the white. A few steps later, the world erased him. Miri's small hand found Cerise's. He helped, the girl whispered. He didn't look at me. Cerise stared at the panel's ribs, trembling with the work of bending what wanted to break. Her chest ached with a tightness she recognized and disliked, relief sharp enough to wound. Not all help is a hook, she said finally. Not all quiet is a trap. Miri lifted the chime to her lips and blew. The little disc answered with a low, contented purl. The storm's teeth dulled toward afternoon. When the light changed from iron to iron soft, Cerise eased the panel's edge and stepped out. The desert was new against coward clean. The dunes shifted into unfamiliar grammar. Jonah lay 30 paces off, face down in the sand, cloak half buried where the wind had tried to claim it. Cerise's eyes went to his hands first, open, empty, fingers curled only on grit. She heard the thin thread of breath at his back. Miri looked up at her, chime cupped in both palms. Sirrah. Cerise crouched, placed her palm against the ground, and listened the way her mother had taught her, not with ears, but with the skin's slow thinking. The desert's song had resumed its customary argument with the sky. The note near Jonah was a living one, but frayed. She stood. Back to the shelf, little bright. She pointed to the ledge where she'd cached dry moss and a lamp. If the wind wakes, sing to it. Miri's mouth tightened not in fear, but in the effort not to show fear. And you? Cerise checked the bone lashings on her forearm, the edge of her glass knife, the balance at her heel. I will move a weight that is not mine. She crossed the intervening sand and rolled Jonah onto his back. Up close, the lines around his eyes were deep with squint and grit. He'd wrapped his forearms in strips of his own cloak to drag the shelter, and the skin beneath was raw. He blinked at her, tried to sit, failed. Don't, he said, and the translator rendered it into a sound that meant, I won't take your thanks, even if you have it. Cerise slid her arms under his shoulders and knees. Humans were heavy in a way her people weren't composed, more of certainty than of air. She carried him anyway, step by sure step, until the shade took his face and the wind forgot him. Why? He mumbled as she propped his head and poured a little water past split lips. Cerise met his eyes. Because my daughter watched you not cross a line, she said, and I want her to learn what that looks like when the wind is a knife. He blinked up at the shelf's rough ceiling, breath becoming a rhythm again instead of an argument. Okay, he said. Lesson learned. Miri crawled closer, eyes wide with the solemnity of children seeing an adult laid low. She set the chime near his shoulder, as if a small sound could keep large silence from swallowing him. Jonah smiled with only one corner of his mouth. Nice music. The translator lagged, then produced a ragged approximation. Good song, Miri beamed. Cerise felt the desert's long memory shift a fraction toward something she would not yet name outside. Dunes rearranged themselves into futures. Inside, three beings who had feared one another earlier shared the sound of breath and the small comfort of a borrowed roof. Cerise watched the man sleep now, not sleep, rebuild, and thought of the stories she would have to revise. Her people had survived by listening to danger. Perhaps the time had come to learn to listen to its absence. To dot by dusk, the wind dropped to a murmur. The panel sang low and satisfied. Jonah woke, accepted a strip of salt meat without argument, and roused himself enough to sit against the rock. He tapped the sand beside him, sketched a long curve, then a square tucked inside it. He pointed to the square, then to Cerise and Miri, then to the curve, then to himself, then to the desert beyond. House, the translator groped, and watch. Cerise understood more than the words. A square where a child could sleep. A curve to bend the storm. A watch set where one could see approach without inviting it. She nodded once. At first light, she said. He found a sense of it somehow and nodded back. At first light. Miri curled under Cerise's cloak, thumb against the notch on her chime where storm and time had smoothed it. Sleep took her in the middle of a question, the way it often did with the young. Cerise answered it anyway, for herself. Not all strangers come to take, she murmured into Miri's hair. Some come to stand on their side of the line. The night cooled. Somewhere out in the open, a lone dune beetle tested the sand with a delicate foot and approved of how it had settled. When the first pale thread of dawn stitched the horizon, Ceres rose. Jonah did the same, wincing but upright. They walked to the place where the gully opened onto the flats and stood a moment without speaking, just to hear the day's first note. House, Jonah said again, tapping the square. Watch, he added, tracing the curve. Then he tapped his chest, then the sand, then drew a line with his boot. He would not cross it. He would build beside it. Cerise let out the breath she hadn't known she was holding. Begin, she said. And the desert listened. Asterisk. The line that became a bridge by the time the second sunrise bled across the dunes. The storm had buried all old tracks. The desert remembered only what it wanted to keep. Jonah worked in silence beside Cerise, the sand rasping under his palms. He had no translator this time. The small disc at Cerise's throat had cracked during the storm. What remained between them were gestures, small sounds, and the way patience translates in any language. Miri brought stones for their foundation, humming the little tune her chime had learned from the wind. Jonah echoed the rhythm with the scrape of his tools. and the sounds tangled child's voice, human labor, desert breath, until they stopped being separate things, when the first wall took shape, curved the way the wind liked. Cerise touched the edge and felt it hold. He listens, she murmured. Miri nodded solemnly. We all listen. 3 days later, the wardens came, desert riders who claimed to keep order where none was wanted. They saw the strange house, the foreign man, and drew their bows. Miri hid behind the curve. Cerise stepped forward. He built with us, she said, in her own tongue, voice low but steady. He bent the storm for our child. The warden's leader frowned, not understanding, and motioned to seize him. But Jonah, reading tone more than words, raised no weapon. Instead, he lifted the chime from Miri's hands, held it high, and blew a single, trembling note. The sound carried, pure, fragile, familiar. The same chime that had belonged to Cerise's mother, the same tone that had warned of storms and called for peace. The riders hesitated. Even the wind paused. Cerise felt something pass between the two sides of the line, fear thinning, replaced by understanding's first thread. When the wardens left, Jonah gave the chime back to Miri without a word. By the season's end, the house stood complete. Curves of glass and stone caught the morning sun and sent it wandering through the dunes. Birds nested in the rafters. Water gathered in quiet bowls. One evening, as dusk painted the sky lilac, Jonah stood apart, looking west. Tomorrow, he said softly, touching the repaired transmitter on his wrist. The translator flickered to life just long enough for Cerise to hear. My people are coming. Miri's face fell. You're leaving, he nodded. You don't need me to build anymore. Cerise studied him for a long time. We still need to remember why we started, she said. Jonah smiled, tired, genuine. Then remember this. I stayed on my side of the line until you invited me across. He turned, walked into the cooling light, and was gone before the stars came. The desert reclaimed footprints quickly, but it could not unlearn a song. Years later, travelers crossing Aurelian would stop when they heard it. The sound of wind passing through glass walls, tuned to the chime's pitch. They said it was the voice of the dunes, or the whisper of old storms made gentle. Cerise knew better. It was the song of a human who had taught them to build without taking, and a people who had learned that not every stranger arrives as a warning. And when Miri was grown, she would tell her own child the truth that survived every storm. Kindness is the only bridge the desert cannot bury.